Welcome back to Country Cow Designs. I'm Jo, and at Country Cow Designs we create sewing patterns for bag makers. So today's tutorial is a free one, and it's for this very quick and simple drawstring bag. If you're new to sewing, this would be a great project to do for your first one because it's really straightforward and you don't need anything much other than fabric and rope to do it. So everything that you need to create this bag is going to be included in the video, all of the measurements and things like that. If you prefer to follow a written pattern, you can download the pattern for free from our website, countrycowdesigns.com. As we make this, you're going to be wondering why the measurements are a little bit strange. Why haven't I rounded up the measurements? That's because this is designed to fit in our leather no-sew tote pattern. So we designed it specifically to fit in this bag. And that is why you're going to come across some slightly strange measurements. Feel free to round up the measurements if you just want a slightly easier thing to cut. So let's get started. To make this bag, you're going to need half a yard of exterior fabric, half a yard of lining fabric. Then you're going to need 82 inches of a cord. So for my cord, I'm using macrame cord. You could use piping cord, or basically any kind of like crafty string will do just fine. I recommend pre-washing your fabrics because this is probably a bag that you're going to be washing regularly. So for the exterior, I am using a cotton fabric. My drawstring tunnels are not interfaced. That's very, very important. You need a light cotton fabric for these two pieces. And then my main panels are interfaced. So for your interfacing, you can use any medium woven interfacing. So Vilene G700 or what else is there, SF101. There's absolutely tons of them that should be available from most craft shops. So any kind of medium woven interfacing will do. It's just to thicken up this exterior fabric. Alternatively, you could just use a heavier canvas fabric for this, but make sure that your drawstring tunnels are a nice lightweight cotton. For the lining, I've got a slightly heavier weight canvas, so I haven't interfaced that. So my pieces are cut out. What you need to do, you need to cut out 2 pieces of lining fabric. It needs to be 15 7/8 of an inch tall by 15 3/8 of an inch wide. As I mentioned in the outset, these are strange measurements because this bag is designed to fit into our no-sew tote. If you want to round up those measurements, there's no harm in doing that so long as you do the same thing on all of your pieces. For my exterior fabric, I have cut it at the same size, 2 pieces, 15 7/8 of an inch tall by 15 3/8 of an inch wide. For my 2 drawstring tunnel pieces, I've cut these at 2 3/4 inches tall by 14 7/8 of an inch wide. And then I've cut my 2 cord pieces at 41 inches each. Throughout this tutorial, we will be referring to seam allowances. If this is your first time sewing, a seam allowance is the distance between the edge of the fabric and the stitch line that you're sewing. So these markers on your machine will tell you what the seam allowance is. This is a 1/4 inch seam allowance, this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Most often with bags you'll find you'll be using 3/8 of an inch, which is in between. You can also see the metric measurements for the seam allowances down here. So for example, if we're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we would line the fabric up with this 1/2 inch line, and then when we sew our stitch line, it's going to be 1/2 an inch away from the edge of the fabric. When top stitching, we use an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. This won't be marked on the plate of your machine. However, it's usually the distance between your needle and the right side of your presser foot. But be aware that this will be different depending on the presser foot that you're using and your particular machine. So the first thing we need to do is cut out the box corners. So I'll turn one of my exterior pieces over, make sure that it's taller than it is wide, and we're going to mark the box corners on the bottom edge. If your fabric has a directional print, make sure that this is the top edge and this is the bottom. And we're just going to mark 2 3/4 inches by 2 3/4 inches square. You're going to do this with all 4 of your main panel pieces, and then we're going to cut along the lines. Once your box corners are all cut out, just set aside your lining for a moment and place your exteriors right sides together. Clip that together or use pins if you prefer, and we're going to sew the sides and the bottom with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure that you backstitch at the beginning and end of each line of stitching. I'm using a 2.5 stitch length, and I'm using a Gutermann's polyester thread, although a cotton thread would work just as well for this type of project. Sometimes when you're sewing like this, you'll find that your fabric will stretch a little bit as you sew. Don't worry too much about it, but if you do have a walking foot, that should stop that from happening. Once you've sewn that, we're going to pull the box corners together. So what you need to do is pull this open, and you want to pull this seam together with this seam. And to make sure it's not too bulky, we're going to push one seam to the left and one seam to the right, then bring them together to match and clip that together. So you can see the rest of the box corner should fit together neatly like that, and just clip it all the way along. Add a couple of extra clips further down here. This will just hold it in place when you're sewing it and make it slightly easier. We're going to do the same thing on this side. Make sure that your bottom seam is folding the same way. So if it was like that, you kind of have a twisted seam. So we want that one's folded left. We're going to fold this one left as well, which means this one's going to the right. So match up those seams and clip them together. And then the rest of the box corner should just close together. Take that over to the sewing machine, and you want to sew this edge with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And you're going to do the same on this side as well. Throughout this project, make sure you're back stitching at the beginning and end of each seam. So the last thing we want to do for this exterior is mark the center on the top edge here. So the easiest way to do that is to pull your seams together, and I'll just clip those in place. And then I'm going to mark the center here. Now, really, you could use any pen you want because you're doing this on the wrong side of the fabric and it's never going to be seen. But I'm actually using a disappearing ink fabric pen. So set that aside and grab your 2 lining pieces. Place your lining panels right sides together and clip them together. We're going to sew the sides and the bottom the same as we did with the exterior, but instead we're going to increase the seam allowance slightly. So at the top we will start with the standard 3/8 of an inch, but after about an inch or so we're going to increase it to a scant 1/2 inch. So that's a bit less than a 1/2 inch. It's somewhere between 3/8 of an inch and 1/2 inch. And what that's going to do is it's going to mean that the lining ends up being very slightly smaller than the exterior. So it will fit nice and neatly inside the exterior. If we sew it with the same seam allowance as the exterior, it's going to end up all saggy and baggy on the inside, which we don't want. So after about an inch, just increase your seam allowance very slightly to a scant 1/2 of an inch seam allowance. And then when you're sewing the bottom, use a scant 1/2 inch seam allowance. When you come back up the other side, you're doing the same thing, but you need to go into a 3/8 at the top. It's important to make sure that you have 3/8 of an inch seam allowance when you reach the top. When you're sewing cotton or lightweight canvas like this, a universal size 70 or 80 needle will be brilliant. Now your lining panels are sewn together, we're going to pull the box corners together again. So same as you did last time, push one of the seams to the right and one to the left, and then match them up and clip them together. Now we're going to sew each of these box corners, and we're going to use 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. set your lining aside for a moment and grab your 2 drawstring tunnel pieces. Place these right sides together and clip them together. Then do the same thing with the second pair. And on each pair, we're going to sew both short edges with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So it's time to get your iron out. Now I've got some extra fabric underneath my pressing mat because I need to protect the cutting mat underneath. What you need to do is press your seams open. So you're gonna get to these seams and then you just wanna press them open like that, butterfly them open, and use the iron to press them. So then they should lay nice and flat. You can then turn this right sides out and make sure that you have got those seams nice and equal so they're not offset. There you go. And then you can just press the seam again from this side. We're just going to top stitch each of these seams to hold them in place. So you're going to do that on both short ends. When you're top stitching, you want to use a slightly longer stitch length. I generally use a 4 or 5 depending what machine I'm using and what its longest stitch length is. You also want to use an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance for top stitching. The next thing we need to do is fold each of these in half. So you're just going to bring the short ends down like that, fold the whole thing in half, and then give it a good press with your iron. If your fabric isn't staying put, you could add some clips here. The next thing we need to do is mark the center on this raw edge on each of these. Because I'm using a dark fabric, it might be a little bit difficult to mark the center. I'm going to bring the ends together and I'm going to mark it by snipping it. So I'm going to snip like a little triangle like that. And then you can see where the triangle point is, that's my center mark. Grab your exterior and turn it right sides out. And what we're going to do is match the center mark on each of these drawstring tunnels to the center mark on the exterior. And we want this drawstring tunnel to be on the outside of the exterior. So first thing I'm going to do is match those centers and then clip it in place. And then just clip it all the way up to the edges. Flip the bag over and get your second drawstring tunnel, and again match the center marks and clip it together. Take this over to the sewing machine, and what we're going to do is we're going to baste these on. Basting is where you do sort of a temporary stitch, so it doesn't need to be, you know, perfect. You don't have to back stitch. You can use a really long stitch length if you want. Or if you don't want to change anything on your machine, you can just sew it like you normally would. So we're going to do that with both of these drawstring tunnels. Basting is always done with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. This means that your basting stitches will be hidden in the main seam allowance later on, and they'll never be visible on your finished project. So grab your lining, and you want your lining to be right sides out. So you're looking at the good neat side of the fabric, like that. And you're now going to have to turn your exterior wrong sides out. So you need to put the lining into the exterior. So what's going to happen is this is the right side of the fabric and this is the right side of the fabric. So it's going to be right sides together. So So match up your seams on the sides here. Now, my exterior seam, I want to make sure that's lying the same way as it is down here. So I'm going to push that to the left at the top, and I'm going to push my lining seam to the right and clip those together where they meet. Do the same thing on the other side of the bag. Once your sides are clipped, you can kind of pull it taut at the top, and then we can add some more clips along here. So I'm going to start at the center. And then I can clip the rest of the bag around this top edge. So before we sew this, we need to know that we're going to be able to turn it out. So we need to leave a gap. We're going to leave a 5-inch gap unsewn. So if you just mark somewhere along the top, then measure and mark 5 inches away from that. Make sure it's on this sort of flat side, not near the seams. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew the whole of this top edge with the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. But I'm going to start at this mark and I'm going to stop at this mark and leave this gap unsewn. As you're sewing, you'll need to move your bag around a bit. Make sure that you leave your needle in whenever you're moving the fabric around. This will make sure that your stitches don't lose their place. Backstitch well when you begin and end this turning gap, because you don't want these stitches to come out when you're turning it. Now, one thing that you can check before we go any further is that your stitches on the underneath are just as neat as the top. If these stitches are starting to look loose, it can indicate that you need to increase the tension slightly on your machine. And it's not so important right now, but once we're top stitching in a minute, you're going to want it to look neat. So it's worth checking it now. And if it's struggling now, you can increase your tension so that your top stitching will look neat when we do it. So what you need to do is stick your hand in through this tiny little gap and pull the whole bag out. Once that's all out, you can push your lining into the exterior and just kind of push the box corners out. Make sure that they're sitting nice and neat. So you want your drawstring tunnels to be sticking up out of the bag, and on one side you're going to have this turning gap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of push in with my hands, make sure that the lining is sitting nice and snug inside the bag. Then I'm going to take this over to the iron. I'm going to press this top edge. So what we're trying to do is just make sure that this is pressed nice and neatly like that. Going to press the inside as well. And where the turning gap is, you just want to make sure that it's folded in line with everything else and give that a press as well. On the sides here, the lining has a tendency to try and pop up. So kind of push it down, make sure it's level with the exterior, and just pop a clip there. You'll probably have to do that on both sides. So you can press the rest of your bag right now as well if you want to, or you can leave it to the end. This is easier if you can put it on the end of an ironing board. But what I also like to do is to grab my box corners here, and then I like to press that flat, and this gives the bag like a more square kind of bottom finish. So there we go. So just do it on both sides. Okay, now I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and I'm going to top stitch all the way around. So I'm going to use a longer stitch length. 4 or 5 millimeter is good. And when we go through this turning gap, it's going to be pulling it closed. So if you're worried about this moving around, You could just put some fabric glue or some double-sided tape in here to hold this closed. Or you could just wing it, or you could pin it in place. I'm going to start where this turning gap is, that way. Hopefully that will reduce how much it moves as I sew it. So we're going to sew around the whole thing, top stitching with 1/8 of an inch away from this seam. Okay, we're at the final step. So we need to fit the string. What I'm going to do, I've got a paper clip. I'm going to tie my cord around the paper clip. This is just going to make it easier to get it through the tunnel. So you're going to feed it in from one end. It can be any end. And you kind of have to shuffle it along, and you can grab the paper clip through the fabric as you do this. This isn't the easiest thing in the world. There are tools that can make this easier, but I wanted to show a paper clip, so if you don't have any special tools, you can just use this. Okay, so pull your paper clip out the end. Make sure this end doesn't slip all the way through. Now we're going to go through the other side and push it all the way to the end again. Now this is where, if you have used a thicker fabric, it is not going to work well. I only recommend a lightweight cotton for these drawstring tunnels, because otherwise you are going to have real trouble getting your cord through. And even once it's through, you're going to have real trouble closing your drawstring if your fabric up here is too thick. So you could use a thicker fabric for the main part of the bag and for the lining, but this top bit, this really has to be a lightweight cotton. Right, once you've got that through, you just want to untie your paper clip. And bring these cord ends to meet, and we're going to tie a little knot in the end here. There you go, like so. So grab your paper clip again, and we're going to do the same thing with this one. We're going to tie it around the paper clip. But we're going to start from the other end. So from this end, we are going to start pushing it through the tunnel, under or above this cord. And your cord does have to be between 3 and 5 millimeters thick. If you go any thicker than 5 mil, you are going to really struggle. But this macrame cord is kind of perfect. Okay, so now that side is through. Take your paper clip off, and same as on the other side, we're going to bring these cord ends together and tie a knot. So there you go, that is your finished drawstring bag, and it should just close as easy as that. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like to know first about new patterns and new video tutorials we have out, make sure you join our mailing list, which will be linked in the video description.